Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you people to invite me here today to speak, and it's great to be in the midst of like-minded people, and maybe some people that share an interest that's off the beaten track by comparison to the mainstream. First thing I'd like to say is what I see where our greatest issue is there's been a role reversal between DNR and the industrial corporations to what it should have been. The road's been paved for the annihilation of our forests underneath the interests of big industry, but enabled by Department of Natural Resources. And the first thing I'd really like to stress is when you have a corporation that is paving the road for this type of activity, what you have to remember is that a corporation's sole purpose is to make money, where a government's role is to govern, direct corporations to a standard that maximizes the benefit to the electorate, ensuring diverse economic and social benefits in an environmentally sustainable manner. And that's not happening today. So I feel one of the big issues today is the corporations are under tenure rather than a tender process, which is largely, believe it or not, the Americans are ahead of us by a long shot. Their federal public lands, the resource is tendered. And with a tender process, at least you maintain the top end value, but within this tenure system, the mills have the ability then to control the destiny of the resource. And in Canada, pretty well the entire system is under tenure to the lowest end user. And I think the biomass plant down here is a great example of what you do with top quality product, is you degrade material to facilitate the demands of your own facility. If you were going to work under a tenure system, you'd be far better off if it was a high-end user that had the tenure, because at least then he would upgrade value. He'd push upgrades rather than devalue grades. The next thing I have to say is that within this tenure system is they're supposed to, underneath direction from Department of Natural Resources, is to ensure that they see that the high-end products within those stands go to smaller mills and facilitate the demands of high-end users, and they don't. The first thing they try to do is to say it doesn't exist. Like my first experience with it was in 1994, after having exported a fair amount of stuff south of the border and taken out a lot of high-end material even within the province. I tried to get access on Crown land, and the first thing I was told is that it doesn't exist. So I went and I sat down with Russ Waycott, who was the Woodlands manager I had worked for, underneath Russ some at Stora. And so he asked me, he said, well, how much of these, this type of material do you need? And I said, well, you're probably going to not believe me, but I said, if you can get 15 what I called top quality crop trees a day, you'll make money at it. And if you're looking at an average, say, of $60 or $70 a tree, it would give you about $1,000 a day plus your byproduct. And those numbers would work on a small operation. Well, he kind of thought I was talking Greek to him, so that didn't go far. The other thing I see today where we're disadvantaged in Nova Scotia is where they started using all mechanized machinery, largely single grip harvesters, to try and cut big hardwood, and it doesn't work. And I've run bunchers, processors, the whole deal, and you can't see what you're working with, and you don't have enough power, oil flow to harvest those trees properly anyway. So they tried to make the transition using everything that was readily available, and that they were defeated before they got started. As a comparison, in Ontario, if you went into Algonquin, I was there one trip and they had 8 skidder crews working on a site. And those 8 skidder crews, one fellow fell for each skidder, one man, each one yarded it to a central location, to the landing. Then it was transported tree length to a central location with a 3-man slasher running it, that one man fed it. One man made the key cuts and the other fellow actually took the wood away. So you only needed, after the tree markers, one key person to produce an average of 8 trailer loads of logs a day is what they were harvesting on that operation. Where today, if you went to do that with a manual shortwood system in Nova Scotia, every key person in that equation, and to do 8 loads a day, you can easily multiply that by 3 men to produce the load of logs, or maybe 4. So you need 20 chainsaw operators that all have to have embedded in their head grades, which your grade values will run from $24.50 a ton to $300 a ton, and there's at least 50 different places in that equation for that product to go. So you have to try to have 50 people or 20 people working at the same capacity of one. So within this short wood system, we're really, really in a bad spot. One thing that I'll point out here is the restricted access on public land for higher value planting. As an example, underneath this new licensing agreement with Port Hawkesbury paper, all the B.A. Fraser ground that was cut in Cape Breton, those were sub-licenses under STORA and under the New Page agreement, and they did approximately 5,000 acres of each. I'm not referring to 5,000 in a blanket, but individual stands that had all been treated with a single crop tree harvesting system. And in those, I did a lot of them for them. And first of all, we ensured to maximize the value of every tree cut. And the next thing was ensuring all the young growth wasn't damaged, and that we did a little thinning as we went. And all that ground that was roaded at the expense of B.A. Fraser, and we had to put in roads that were to a level that wasn't necessary, but every deterrent that could be put in the way of the added value player was used in order to try and disadvantage them, try to make them go home or go broke. But the worst thing I can say about all that in the end was that was not even recognized by the present owners of Port Hawkesbury paper, that those stands now are being re-roaded, brushed to make them ready to be harvested for biomass. And in this video we're going to look at, I'll stress what I really see the great problem is that there's no value being put beyond a tree that's 7 inches in diameter, for instance, or 5 inches, that's bowl straight, that is our future crop tree. They only recognize it for the value it has today, which is at $21.50 a ton for chipper wood, which calculates to $1 a ton is what the province has allowed this wood to be degraded to in terms of stumpage to the people of Nova Scotia. On paper, what Dan Knight had told me, stumpage value for biomass is $3.50 per ton, but if they do any treatments or any road access, they can bring it down to $1. So they're taking this growing stock that is 1/3 grown, and they're devaluing it to nothing. Larchwood products in Margaree was continually beat up, couldn't get access to 200 cords of larch a year in order to run their mill that's added value. They make a great product, everything from cutting boards to cupboards to flooring. Rivers Bend was strung along tremendously, that they were going to get access to logs, promised it so that they wouldn't go on side with private individuals like myself to source logs. And they really believed that they stuck with the big players, they'd have been safe. Well, you see what happened to them. Groupe Savoy, has done a big part in this province in terms of giving landowners an option to capture a variety of added values in hardwood, from pallet wood to grade saw logs. They even facilitate bringing in veneer grades and sorting them for landowners at no charge, just a handling charge, which is minuscule. And they in turn they're the only big player in the province that doesn't have one crown allotment. A little bit in the new agreement, but it's away from their mill and there's really nothing guaranteed yet. One thing I found was pricing in the stumpage that any of us that were doing sub-licenses like I did for Fraser's. I'll give you an example. We were cutting 40 kilometers from the pavement in the Kepi Highlands in Cape Breton, and I was taking the firewood out after the saw logs, and the provincial rate being $3.50 a ton or $7 a cord for firewood, which is what biomass is recognized for, they added on what they called management fees and administration fees, and they brought that up. This is back about 8 years ago, was the last I cut under the old New Page license, and they brought those fees up. $27 a cord stumpage is what I had to pay, and then I also had to facilitate the cost of 40 kilometers over roads that were basically hardly travelable. You could bring high-grade material out, but to bring that onto the cost, so it wasn't viable. And the quote I used to David Fraser, he had said, well, do what you can and make the best of it. And I said, it doesn't work. those numbers just won't come together with that type of a stumpage fee that's been put on the firewood. They use bully tactics to control staff who they work for. I've had Morty McNeil. I worked with him a long time. Good guy. He was the technician I worked under with B.A. Fraser. So after he went with NewPage at that time, I'd had him doing some private work. So one day I went into the pulp mill to take him in a check for work he did for me, and to take him in another bit of paperwork for some work I wanted followed up. And I was met with Marvin Hudson at the door and asked, he's a company man for the mill, and you know what I was looking for, and I said Morley. So I went in, and I knew he was outside the door the whole time we were talking. And so when I left, he asked Morley, he said, what was that about? And he said, well, I do some work for Danny, and he and I have been friends for years. And so after that, he was told not to do any more work for me, you know. So later on, I had called him for a recommendation on something else, and I asked him, I said, Morty, I've had 3 letters of recommendation. I said, I'm asking one from you because you and I worked side by side for a number of years. And he said, Danny, you know more about hardwood than anybody in Nova Scotia. And I said, will you put that on paper? And his retort was, I'll have to ask my employer if I can write you that letter. And that's a fact. And at that time, he was on with Port Hawkesbury Paper. That was when they had taken ownership of the mill. So the way they control their staff, they control their voice. It's censorship to the worst degree. So those are the type of tactics that they put out there. You know, I've had sawmill owners tell me, people from the mill, that they were told, you know, not to buy logs from me. And I mean, that's as blacklisted, as blackballed as you can get. But anyway, I had a good relationship with the mills, and they stuck by me. And just as another thing, as an overview, when it comes to sawmills, is you just look how many sawmills are in existence east of Truro. You got Williams's in Barney's River, who survived largely because of their affiliation with Scott Paper, Northern Pulp, whoever you want to call them, and that enabled them to be there. But every sawmill that was around in the 60s and 70s are gone, and it was because of the big hand that came from that mill from the word go. Certification. I know some people have a great lot of faith in it, but to me it's somewhat of a joke from the perspective that it's paid for by industry. And I make a likeness of it if compare, you know, the Mexican drug cartels and the Mexican police. It's not much different. When I had Keith Moore, when we did this video, come from the Rainforest Alliance, who was the person that was in charge of certification with these lands that at that time were under NewPage and now Port Hawkesbury Paper. And as a result of this, they asked him to delay his report from what he saw until their certification was completed. So they're controlling them. And this is how, and I didn't fully understand how it worked. And at the time I said to Keith, well, you know, what's happening here? And I said, who's paying you? Like, you know, I thought it was some form of a lobbyist group or something that looked after certification. And he said, no, industry's paying us. Well, basically the bottom fell out of it then for me, because, you know, if I'm hiring my own police force, you can pretty well get away with what you want to. So I'm skeptical. Greg Fraser, who would be our private lands forester and Crown land forester in the eastern region, and I'd brought a lot of these things to Greg's attention in the past, and so finally one Saturday morning he called me up, and he was pretty distraught, but as upset as a man could get, and he said, his quote was, and he mightn't like that I say this, but he wouldn't deny it, and he said, Danny, I'm not practicing the forestry I was trained to practice. I'm not practicing the forestry I believe in. I'm practicing the forestry I'm told to practice. And when that comes from the man in charge, and it really makes you wonder, you know, where do you go from here? Like, you know, he's signed to a code of ethics, and the code of ethics doesn't have much value when that's how they operate.
Yeah, Dan, I just wanted
yes?
that's DNR that Greg, some people wouldn't know.
Okay, that's right, Bob. I'm sorry, thanks for, yes, and Greg was the Department of Natural Resources forester for the eastern region in Nova Scotia. From a wildlife perspective, You know, we have special classification areas for moose. In Cape Breton is lynx, and for marten, it just doesn't get any recognition. It's all on paper. Like, this certification process, from what I can see, would look great on paper for somebody that was sitting in another country and reading this, and they'd think, well, these people have everything well looked after. But what's on paper and happens on the ground, it doesn't work. We have an area in eastern Guysborough County, and I know Bob's familiar with this one, and it was probably one of the last little refuges for moose that was left. And so DNR took it upon themselves. This was after the New Page mill went down, and they built 7.5 kilometers of road into an area that timber's basically worthless. What's on it is barrens and bogs, and I'd been in there a couple of times, saw quite a bit of moose sign, and the moose sign has disappeared since the road system's been in. I know one was shot last fall that ended up, what I was told, it wintered in Dover, basically in a freezer. So that's what happens when they have no regard for these. You know, that's an endangered species. Lynx habitat in the highlands, and they wonder why our lynx population is where it's at. I can remember in the late 70s, I used to skin fur for a fur buyer, and I spent a lot of time there buying fur, and I can remember some of the native trappers get 20, 25 lynx a winter. There wouldn't be 25 lynx caught in the island now in a year. And even the marten population, you know, they say they didn't exist. Well, in 1979, I was working there trail cutting on the budworm salvage, and I saw a marten, and I knew what marten were. A lot of people hadn't been familiar with them, and I'd seen them in raw fur form at the fur sales in Montreal and North Bay. So I saw a marten where I was cutting, and I reported that. That was never registered. And finally, in the end, somebody caught one in 1999 in Cape Breton. Well, they had to recognize it when it was caught in a trap as a bycatch, right? Hush money. This is a big one that I see. This one here is actually horrendous. During what they called the hot idle process when the mill was down, they had what they called training in hardwood to train these contractors that had predominantly cut softwood. And they were trained with public money. Now, I have nothing against training if it's done right, and nobody'd be more in favor of it. But I'm going to tell you the tune of what training was done. One contractor that's now packed it up in that industry, because of a lot of it was the internal politics more than anything else. He told me he took 5 pieces of gear and put them on site, each one full of fuel, for the 3 weeks. Now, this contractor would hire me to go in when he was doing a stand, and I'd go in and pre-tag. I do this a lot. I pre-tag the trees for the contractor, and he goes in and mows everything down of value. And then in the last few days of the harvest, I'll go in and cut those logs to grade, and I do them on a percentage to ensure that at least they get the maximum value out of it. And I was still doing them after he took the course. But for the course, he had to put 5 men on site. It didn't matter if they were guys who were going to be on that machine afterwards, but it kept them, ensured the seat was full, per se. And he got $150,000 for those 3 weeks, and neither machine burnt a tank of fuel in it. Now, this was paid for out of this money to keep everybody in place and supposedly keep them in existence until a new buyer was found, right? And to quote the fellow that put the instruction on, Glenn Baker did the instruction in a fire hall, because they did some in the classroom and some out in the woods, and he shook his head about it all afterwards. He said the best student he had was Randy McDougall's dog. Yeah, like there was nothing achieved. So one of the other contractors that had took the course, and he had 4 pieces there, so he got $120,000 for the 3 weeks. And it wasn't 6 months later at the local machine shop one day. I was in there, and he had gear in there getting worked at, and he asked me, he said, is there anybody here I can hire to cut some hardwood logs for me? And I said to him, I said, Tommy, you took that course, that $120,000 course, you should be able to cut hardwood logs. And he laughed, you know. So this is how our money was spent. But the main purpose of that money was to keep these contractors on side so nobody would speak out. And that's the whole deal that's taken place, is they have access to the public purse in order to buy support and people to follow them. So that was kind of a big one. The other one is the land purchase pertaining to this hush money of people in favor, in political favor. Like, I'm not going to name any particular names here, but But I know one fellow that was paid in the vicinity of $1 million for 900 acres of cut over ground, and there wasn't a bush left on it. I have another fellow I know very well. There's a friend of mine in DNR called me up one day, and he said, "Do you know such and such?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I'm just doing up," he said, "a land purchase agreement for his." And he said, "There's not a bush left on it." And he said, "He's getting 235 acres, 235,000 for 210 acres of cut over ground." And this went on in a pretty big way, and some of that ground was taken and protected. Now, why you would protect land that was completely annihilated and use public money to do that, there's only one reason, is to buy support for the direction that you're on, right? So that's why you don't hear anybody speaking out. I've sold cut over ground of my own, and $250 an acre, that's about the best I could get out of it, right? So Crown license allows them to cut sawables into pulp. This is a big one. Be the fall of 2014, a neighbor and I went in on a job Langels were doing, and we drove in. It was too soft to truck the wood, and we come out, and I said to Scott, I said, "There's 1,000 trailer loads of wood piled up in here." And he said, "You think?" I said, "Yeah, I guarantee you there is." So I had went around the road system, and it encompassed a little over a square mile. So I called Greg Fraser when I got home, and I said, "Greg, the softwood pile in there is 60 to 70% sawables." And I said, "I can remember when that was PCT 20 years ago. Now, it was pre-commercial thinned with public money, and the purpose of pre-commercial thinning is to grow sawables. It's not to grow pulpwood." So I said to Greg, I said, "There's about 700 acres cut in there." "Oh, I don't think," he said, "that's a 120 acre license." I said, "Well, you better check." So he called me back, and he said, "You're right." He said, "There was 3 licenses, and they cut them all." So I said, "What about the sawables?" And he said, "Well, in the new agreement the government has with Port Hawkesbury Paper, they can cut sawables if they deem that they foresee a shortfall in wood supply in their mill yard. They can cut sawables into pulp." Well, years ago we used to get a winter bonus a lot of winters, so the price would go up in the fall of the year, and you'd get a little more money for pulp because they anticipated a shortage. So how you can ever anticipate getting an extra price increase when they allow them to take Crown resource and devalue it to a low-end product, it'll never happen. So what they've done is they've taken our Crown resources and they've used it to devalue the private sector's resource. And you may as well beat your head against the wall if you ever think you're going to get price increases with that type of enabling by Department of Natural Resources. So the next thing I have here is, but I guess that basically was where I see a lot of the issues from the corporation side. And with natural resources, in my opinion, they're the greatest offender of all, because at least a corporation is meeting their primary goal, which is to make money. But natural resources' primary place is to look out for our interests as citizens and to protect us and work as a barrier between corporations and what the acts are taking part on the ground. And here again, I'll go to that tenure system. Their control is exercised by the big mills. And a tender system would maximize value, where a tenure system, all it does is devalue and facilitate the demands and the needs, or the wants, I should say, of industry. The other one I want to address here, I guess, is a bureaucracy. In my beliefs, I know a lot of people, this is a sore point, but in my opinion, when a government changes, every bureaucrat should go with it, right down to the janitor. And they make, there's connections and there's marriages made there inside between bureaucrats and industry. And when those people don't change, the elected official that's coming in there, he's dependent upon those bureaucrats to direct them, to give him information. But when the information he's getting is basically tainted information because of the connections made between industry and bureaucrats, I don't think you'll ever get very far with it. And I'll use the example, and this is a real ironic one, and I'll use the Lloyd Hines deal with the land deal in Guysborough as an example. And it was probably the only case I've seen that somebody misled a department to the degree that he did, and then became minister of that department years later. But what enabled him to do it was the fact that Danny Graham, who was deputy minister at the time, underneath the McClellan government, he stayed on as deputy minister under the new Conservative government. And it was put forth before the change of government, and then very quickly after the new government came in, he was awarded that piece of property. And that information is all here, right from word go to the end. And I was the one that did all the background work on that before Eva Hoare put it in the paper. I spent years trying to get to the bottom of this. And it was only because a piece of it was sold that I was able to find out what took place. But it was, he acquired that land from the province because he was going to expand a golf course, put in hiking trails, and use it for the expansion of community good. And that was how the Crown got it originally, was the fellow that sold it to the Crown. It was to be left for community good, for outdoor recreation. So the irony in it is that Mr. Hines acquired it under a false pretense, and as you can see there, if anybody cares to look at it, from the point of him acquiring it from the Crown and the point of him selling it to a European was 4 months, and the transfer were both done the same day. So it was a flip that he took Crown land and flipped it to a European for private interests, and it never ever was used for outdoor recreational good or expansion of a golf course or anything else. So I guess what I'm pointing out here is that when that type of, and I'm not going to say man, I won't use that term here, when that type of thing is elected by the people and then it becomes a minister of a department that we're trying to deal with, I think you really should realize what it is we're all up against. It's not a good situation, right? It's actually, to me, it's been more detrimental, the politics in this equation, than the industry has. Preferred deal for mills as far as stumpage goes, in terms of funding for reforestation. I mean, a lot of us own private woodland, and who's administering those funds? It's being administered within the Port Hawkesbury Paper Office, and there's no way that you can have, that type of an industrial user in charge of funding. It's you go up in the Highlands and you look at where they did what they call strip cuts, and they called them an experiment. And anywhere that they call an experiment, it involves funding. And they made some points that they were trying to break down the age classification to prevent future infestation from budworm, but in that equation, they were able to incorporate public money to subsidize the harvesting cost of this fiber that wasn't economical to harvest. I find from the part of DNR, they do not represent the electorate. In turn, the electorate is subservient to the mills. No accountability on the GIS system. And in the typing in the GIS system is one of the things that enabled them to do what they did in eastern Guysborough County. We are basically the fiber basket for that biomass plant. And what I envisioned happening there is what happened in western Guysborough County was devastated to facilitate the pulp mills. And what we're about to see in eastern Guysborough County are these tolerant hardwood stands were about to be labeled biomass, and they were labeled biomass. So as I got digging through this, what I was able to come to terms with was that all the information in the GIS system was wrong. It was all termed 85% intolerant hardwood rather than it be termed 85% tolerant hardwood. So that's why I pulled that little stunt I did here a couple of years ago, the picture of the low logs that was on Facebook and all over the place. I had cut that in a stand, a private, that was like an island in the big Crown Forest. And I knew what had taken place, so I went into DNR to get everything documented before I took the photograph and had the sign made. And I asked them, I said, what's the classification? And they looked it up, and that's all classified 85% intolerance. So that's what brought that on, was to try and bring to the public eye that the typing in this GIS classification was what enabled DNR to devalue all our forests to be, on paper at least, they're recognized as nothing but biomass. That's the, Matt, maybe you might help me out on that. You can.
Forest inventory.
Yes, that's what it is. I thought you maybe had a little more detail on that than I did, but.
Is that global information system?
Geographic information system. But yeah, that's the forest inventory, and that you should be able to go anywhere in the province and look at the GIS information and the land classification and find out what the species component is and what the height of it is and the classification. So it's if it was done right, it would be great information to have there. But what's happened is a lot of it it misrepresents truly what's there, and what DNR was able to do with, or industry was able, I should say, to do with this, is to use it in a way to purpose it for their own devaluation. And in the whole time leading up to the video, and that's partly what brought this on, is this, it was leading up to this is where I was able to come to terms with how this was able to take place, is that it was all, Dan Knight had said, well, it's all eight, and he would be the operations man that was looking after those Crown lands. It's all showing that it is intolerant. So it took a lot of different attempts to try and bring it to light. So in the end, when I had Greg Fraser in there, he agreed with me that it was all, the Crown landsman, that it was all mistyped. So when I called, I can't recall the guy's name in Truro, to report this and look for it to be changed, I was laughed at. He said, what do you want me to do with it? And I said, I want it changed. It's wrong, we've proven it wrong, and it'll never be changed. So they're basing their harvesting practices and their volumes and everything else upon information that isn't accurate. So it's just a facade of what they would like you to think.
Can you explain what the difference is between tolerant and intolerant? We're not foresters.
Oh, no, okay. Tolerant hardwoods are your high quality hardwoods, your yellow birch, hard maple, and your intolerants are stuff like white birch, soft maple, popple, and your tolerant hardwoods are long-lived species, and it's where you get your grade. The other stuff is pulp and some biomass and even some low-grade lumber, but it just doesn't have the, it's not what you're trying to achieve in good forestry. In hardwood, you're trying to achieve a tolerant hardwood forest.
The tolerance is in regards
To
to
light.
tolerance to shade or light. The tolerant hardwoods will grow under a canopy, whereas your intolerants need an open. So a clear cut's going to pop up in these lower grades, whereas when you're trying to thin through a tolerant hardwood stand, you can expect on the ground is the good stuff to pop up because it's tolerant to that shady condition.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, no, you do a better job on that than I do.
Can you explain when and who did the GIS classification?
It was done by the province. The first time I ran into problems with it was in the late 80s. And how it came to my light was a landowner that I'd cut a property for. It was over 700 acre property, and he came to me with the plan, and he paid a lot of money to have this done, and it was done by Atlantic Forestry Consultants. And this area was quite remote. You would have had to have hiked into it a considerable amount at that time, a couple of miles. So he gave me the plan, and I knew the property well, and I looked at it, and it had said 85% intolerant hardwood. And when I looked at it, I said, well, Ian, I think it was $1,200 he paid for it. And I said, well, that's great, but it's not worth the paper it's written on. And he got kind of offended. What do you mean? And I said, well, you've got 85% tolerant hardwood. And I said, it's saying it's 85% intolerant. I said, right off the bat, I'm going to tell you, they never walked on it. They never had been in the woods. So they just wrote it up and charged him a bill for it. And he was a lawyer, this guy, and lived in Ottawa. So they knew he'd never seen the land, never ever was on it. So, but I still didn't quite make the link then that all of it was mistyped in this eastern region. And where a lot of the problems come from is that, when they redo this photographs and this interpretations, nobody is really questioning the classification before them, so they're retyping it. They're just putting it back out there, right? So when you really go to them to point out that it's wrong, then they don't want to do anything about it anyway. So I asked the question, I said, was this done by DNR staff or was it done by a contractor? And he said, why do you ask? And I said, well, if it was done by DNR staff, I'd fire them. And if it was done by a contractor, I'd sue them. But those are the types of things that nobody wants to be involved in within the department. Like, things are they'd rather shove them under the rug than they would deal with them. Like, nobody wants to make a stink, whether it's firing somebody or a lawsuit. And I think that's where some of the problems lie within that department. The other one that this one here might really throw you. was they changed the definition of old growth. Now, when I think of old growth forest, I think of old growth, 100, 150 years. I don't really think of its straightness or anything like that. So they changed the definition of old growth, and I don't have the actually written component of the length of the bowl and the diameter here, but as I listened to it, as it was told to me by one of their people at Port Hawkesbury Paper, at New Page at that time, same guys there under a different name, the only place that tree could qualify because of the length of the bowl and the straightness of it and the diameter was in an inoperable ravine. And it basically could only be a hard maple or an ash because a yellow birch wouldn't reach that height that was required. So after a while I got to catch on a little bit with this because they asked around through the certification process, were there any unique sites that anybody thought deserved special recognition under the old growth category? So I said, yeah, and I kind of appreciated the fact that they asked this. I didn't think they were capable of it. But anyway, I picked out a place that I thought was the best grove of yellow birch I've ever seen in Nova Scotia. And it wasn't a big stand. It was a 100-acre block, but 65 acres of this kind of material. So they sent their people in to look at it, and about 2 months later I get the reply on it that it didn't qualify because it was too crooked. Now, it never had an axe in it. Right back, my great-grandfather was nearly 100 when he died, and he'd spent his life in the woods, and when I was a kid growing up, he'd continue to ask me where I was at, where I was working, what I was seeing, and I'd mentioned these stands to him, and he'd said they never were cut. Those stands never had an axe. One thing being the area we were in, Guysborough County had no railroad, and our road systems were somewhat limited, and if it was softwood it was cut because you could float it, but you couldn't float hardwood, so you couldn't drive it. So these places, they escaped the axe. But in these stands, they were standing 2 veneer logs long, and I had a buyer in at one time from Maine, and I asked him, I said, have you ever saw a better stand? And this guy was 67 at the time, and that's all he ever did was buy high-grade hardwood, had worked in the bush and buy high-grade hardwood for the last 25, 30 years. And he said, I'm not saying I haven't, but it's been a long time, but he said, it's not often I can stand, and the canopy was on then, and I can look in a circle around me, and your vision in a hardwood ridge when the leaves are on is no more than 200 meters. But he said, it's a long time since I've stood and I could stand around and look and see $10,000 standing around me. And that was the case of it. But that didn't qualify because it was too crooked. So this brought on the fact that I really lost faith in certification, and I could see that the benefits of certification were certainly greater to industry in maintaining this facade to the public of what great stewards of the land they were than it was ever going to be to the forest. So that kind of led up to doing this video. So they got away with creating their own definitions of old growth. So then the next one was when they redefined the definition of a clear cut. Now, when you can reconstruct a definition to suit industry, to me it's pretty profound. Like, I always thought a definition was something that didn't change, and if you wanted to fall within that category, you had to measure up to the definition. But they changed the definition to suit themselves. And that enabled them to take clear cutting in the province from 90% to under 50%, but they didn't change practices, they only changed definition. Dan Knight would be the operations manager that I had in with the minister and deputy minister viewing these stands that are in this video, because after doing the video I was threatened with a lawsuit. So I got the minister, John McDonnell, and Brian Gilbert was the deputy minister at the time, to come in and view these from a different point of view. And I brought who would be one of the most recognized hardwood specialists at that time in North America. He's now retired, was retired at that time, was Don George, who was the superintendent of foresters at Algonquin Park for 20 odd years. So he came unannounced, and New Page had their contingent, mill management, foresters, and so did Department of Natural Resources. But in these stands that you're going to see in here, what the upper brass of Department of Natural Resources, what their vision is to flatten it all, clear cut the entirety of it, and start over. So I asked them, well, what is your vision at starting over? And they said, well, at 15 years we'd go in and thin it, which is exactly half the time before you should even think about going near hardwood. And then in 30 years, their vision was to go in and take out what they could deem merchantable and bring it out and not hurt anything else. And well, I asked them if they were going to bring in a complete flotilla of helicopters, because there's no other way you're going to get it out without damaging everything else that's grown in this young mass. And it would have no value at 30 years. They were envisioning where it could be maybe at 50. So that was their plan, was to devalue it and then annihilate it in order to accommodate the biomass plant. So my neighbor and I, Scott Cook and I, we had took it upon ourselves to make this video, and we did get support from the municipal unit until the lawsuit was threatened. And when the lawsuit was threatened, then they backed out. And in the midst of that, at the presentation that Scott and I did at the municipality, at the end of the meeting, they called me into a back room, 3 of the staff members that were with NewPage at the time, 2 of them are presently with Peroxbury Paper, as to what it would take to take down roadblocks to this video. That was before we had put it on YouTube. And I declined. They weren't going to buy me. I wasn't going to be bought out anyway, but how characters like that they ever thought that you could trust them in a room with 3 of them and me alone is beyond me. You know, like. So one thing I'd like to, I guess, maybe just touch on here is the history of government throwing people to the mercy of pulp mills in Nova Scotia goes back a long ways. And through these years, since I had a change in direction, I searched pretty hard as to where it got started. And my father had cut wood for that mill, my grandfather. And needless to say, nobody ever really made any money, but work was basically it. But I stumbled upon a book that Peter Clancy wrote. It's called Against the Grain. And I firmly believe it should be mandatory reading for everybody that's involved within the Department of Natural Resources and the paper industry. But in the late 50s, there was a fellow by the name of John Bigelow that did a great job. And John, he worked for the Department of Agriculture, but by today's terms, we'd call him an economic development officer. So he was in charge of going around to all the rural communities and finding out what people had available for wood and what they might be interested in harvesting and what they had for any kind of machinery to get it out. And it wasn't much machinery, it was basically horses at that time. So this was about a 3-year period. And this was after the Swedes had expressed an interest in putting the mill here. So finally, after the 3 years, and they got an idea of inventories, and they realized that they had to have a Crown license in order to ensure the viability of a mill. So they sat down with Bob Stanfield, and in the book, Bob's named, but the 2 ministers that were in the same meeting weren't. So Bigelow and the Swedes sat down, and they made an offer to the government of the day for stumpage within that agreement. And they offered $3.62 a cord. And he said, Bob Stanfield sat back in his chair, and he said, I think that's too much. Yeah. And that's what set our benchmark. He said, I think $1 per cord is more appropriate. This was now in 1958, the same rate that the Mersey got in 1929. So he took us back a long ways in terms of setting the benchmark of pricing to move forward. And for me, it answered a lot of questions as to how we ended up where we ended up today, because that's how we started. And Stanfield was a businessman. That's what his history was here. And from what I could read in it, at no point did he ever want to increase wages in eastern Nova Scotia. It wasn't in his interest to have people any better off. So by keeping them poor, you keep them controlled. And that's what's happened right until this day. My visions on a new forest, on a new direction, I think we missed the opportunity, and I'd call it we missed the boat when the mill went down. And it was an opportunity we still had something left to work with, and I see it largely in our eastern area because we have hardwood forests that, believe it or not, most people don't believe this, that had been untouched. And it was in the same state that when the mill started in 1960, but yet we had the machinery and the technology that we have today. And that doesn't happen very often, that you have a virgin forest and you have 50-year technology advanced. So I think we're heading for at some point here, we're heading for a post-pulp mill future. And sadly, the longer the pulp mill and the biomass run, the less we'll have to work with in terms of a wood for added value. I believe that the facilities need to be part of a future plan, as does DNR staff. DNR must be both available and accommodating to small operations in terms of locating and layout of products. Today, DNR are basically there for pulp mills, but I say there are more among them who see and acknowledge the wrong that has been done. In the past, they operated more as an enforcement position for the mills and did not take to questioning very well. And I see within some of the young fellows within DNR now, they'll sit down and they'll tell you they see what's wrong. And they do see that there has to be some form of a change. But those people are not playing on the top end. They're not on line with the bureaucrats. And maybe in time that'll change, but as time goes by, we lose more and more and more of that resource that will enable us to meet the financial demands to move forward. A new economic management plan must be a multi-use plan that balances sustainable forest management, maximize the value of primary forest products while ensuring preservation of wildlife habitat, and if done so, will enhance recreational opportunities. Doors must be open to people interested in areas such as maple sugar production, using forest canopy to aid in the growing of mushrooms, ginseng. I believe many of our large lakes should be subdivided for water frontage, suitable for commercial and recreational development, as well as some sold for cottage lots. Without incorporating the recreational people into a new model, it won't work. Our rural areas need that continuous flow of cash, and we need access to these overcut forests to drive rural economies. We need to practice wildlife enhancement, improve fish populations, and most of all, create a destination that they'll return to. Something similar to what Nova Scotia was in the 1920s for the American sportsman. The only, example I see that incorporates all these together is the Halliburton Forest in Ontario, which is a vision that I see we need here on a grand scale. First of all, in value added to primary forest products, accommodations on site, retail and value added wood products, snowmobiling, cross-country skiing, fishing and hunting, and unique opportunities that they have there, such as a wolf interpretive center and actually a submarine in one of their bigger lakes. I don't know if any of you here are familiar with the Halliburton Forest, but it's a 70,000 acre tract of ground south of Algonquin Park, and it's owned by Peter Schleichenbaum, who's a German that inherited that property, and what he did with it was wonders. Started with a hardly cut piece of forest. He's a small sawmill on site that uses about 200,000 feet, but every board that leaves there in added value form. And they have, on their lakes, it's broken up for a variety of opportunities with fishing and hunting. If any one of the group of us wanted to rent a camp there for moose season, for instance, you know, it's 1,500 to 2,500 acres in each parcel that we have exclusive rights for that week. The camps are rented for fishing, the largest private snowmobile club in the world. He has a wolf interpretive center, as I mentioned, that is used for studies worldwide. They put on a lot of educational systems there, educational programs, as Bob had told me he had taken a course there. I think these are the types of things that we have to look at. We have to incorporate a variety of different interest groups into one joint direction. Certainly better than the one that's at hand. Typically, a good hardwood forest has got about 3 age classifications in it, and you can remove the older story and the larger, the older trees, and ensure that you leave the next 2 generations, so that you got to remember when the next fellow comes back in 50 years, he's cutting a tree that was of the 2nd age category, not the one that was number 1. And that does, equal sustainability. And we have a lot of stands here that demonstrate that were really heavy in the 50s. And those stands make some of the best cuts of lumber that are left today, because I would be harvesting the stuff that was of the 2nd age class when they were there in the 50s. So you're looking at a 50 to 60 year rotation is what you're looking at, with maybe a 30-35% removal. A single crop harvest is a harvest that concentrates on getting a specific tree, typically a valuable tree, and as well in that, not only are you taking out that tree, but you're opening up the stand so the smaller ones that are adjacent to it have room for crown expansion. And in a single tree harvest, it's probably the most efficient means of getting the high grade out of the material. It's done hands-on. You're treating each tree as an individual, and you're as close to that tree as you can get, so you see any defects where within a large-scale industrial mechanical harvest, the distance from the tree will prohibit you from being able to identify the defects in the same manner. I think that's a comparison.
But your equipment is also geared to hardwoods, is it not?
I do these single tree harvests mainly with a chainsaw and a cable skidder, and the main reason I choose a cable skidder over, I seldom ever use my forwarder, but the cable skidder, it gives me the ability to pull in maybe 100 or 150 feet of cable if there's only one tree in a young stand that I see as my target. Could be a variety of reasons. One is high value, and the other one is if I see that it's overpowering a lot of young growth that can't really get the light it should, then it enables me to pull it out without damaging. You do not have to drive to the tree as you do with a forwarder or a grapple skidder, and that's your greatest advantage.
And UPage is proposing to use the heavy mechanized equipment that's specific to softwood harvesting.
That's typically what they've done. They've reapplied their softwood machinery to hardwood stands, and we'll see later today, it's quite visible that they're not able to handle those types of trees effectively when you see what's left, simply because they can't take the limbs off them, where with a chainsaw system it's done in a short time, very, very easily, very effectively. All that young wood from, you know, a seedling to a 50-year-old tree is left there to grow and do the best it can. That kind of, from my perspective, kind of sums up one of the important parts of it. And it's hard to put it in context without seeing it, and when you see it, it will come together. Browns Mountain is a private woodlot that I cut in 2004, and it was what we call a single selection crop tree cut. Mainly what the goal is here is to get the maximum value of each tree harvested in that stand. It would be the older, mature trees. And the other goal you try to achieve is to create as less damage, minimize any damage to the younger trees that are left standing. Typically overall, we probably go with a target of 35% is where I try to be. Some areas will be a little more, some a little less, depending on the age classification within that stand. I got some numbers here, if this helps, on some on the actual tree counts on that stand and averages. There was 1,248 trees, 1,248 trees rather, that were harvested on 65 acres. The average return to the landowner on that was $436.12 per acre, which calculates roughly $30.37 per ton in stumpage. That's a mix of the variety of grades, which consisted of 482 ton of saw logs, 62.64 ton of veneer, and 185 cords of hardwood firewood, which represents 388.5 tons as well. But this would be what I'd call a decent stand, and it was one that was cut as well about 50 to 60 years ago. So what it demonstrates is that crop tree harvests can be sustainable, I feel, in this area on about a 50-year rotation. So you'll see it as a living ecosystem and not a moonscape or a clear cut. It's still, has the same wildlife habitat that it would have had prior to harvest. So actually it offers a variation of uses after a harvest, and the return that the landowner would get on that is fourfold by comparison to the 1,000 acres that New Page, you know, closely clear-cut on provincial crown land. $250 would be what they're willing to pay for the biomass, but on the stand I have here, the paperwork on, they cut 19,000 tons and paid $102,000. Now that was a mix of saw logs, veneer, and biomass. The average, just give me a second here, the average of everything included in that works out to $5.39 a ton. So their rate of $5.39 compares to mine, $30 and change. And theirs has got a 95% removal in terms of trees, and mine's got a 35% removal.
So what would be the disadvantages of using softwood harvesting equipment in a hardwood stand if biomass is supposed to be a byproduct of, at least from a hardwood point of view, for sawlog and veneer harvesting? What would be the disadvantages of using the softwood mechanized equipment in a stand?
Mainly what they're using here is a feller buncher, a head of a processor. And the feller buncher, the majority of them only have a 20-inch cut. So what you'll see later today is when they go to cut a tree off that's over 20 inches, you'll see where it shatters it on the other side, and we call it a barber chair, and they will end up breaking a slab off it that could be sticking up 6 inches, or it could be 2 feet, or it could be 6 feet, which renders that log, you know, losing a great deal of value. And when those heads are reaching their maximum cutting diameter, after they've hit 2/3 of their maximum cutting diameter, they lose momentum, they lose speed with that saw head. So then you're trying to push that tree over, basically is what it comes down to. And in that process, you cause shatter in the tree. It'll split and you'll tear it. And when the processor follows that buncher, if there's any kind of heavy limbs, which you'll see later today, and they don't have to be really heavy, they don't have the ability to pound the limbs off them or to complete the harvesting of that particular piece of wood. We'll get a look at that type of thing a little later. What I've tried to do here is basically to duplicate what was done in 1950, and we did it in 2004, and it's quite safe to look at this is to say that this stand could sustain that same type of harvest in another 50 years. And yet it's still a living ecosystem. It's a living forest. As you can see here, you know, the advantages of skidding by comparison to forwarding, you've got pretty well 100% yellow birch regeneration. And if you look up, the irony in this is that in this stand it was only consisted of 10% yellow birch. But by using a skidding method rather than a forwarding method, you will get pretty well exclusive yellow birch regen. Yellow birch is certainly a better tree in terms of wildlife, and although it doesn't bring the highest price per board foot, a yellow birch stand will out-yield dollar-wise a maple stand any particular time. Like here, those are the holes where we actually harvested. We took the bigger trees out. It doesn't even look like a harvest. One there, there's stumps all through this. This was strictly cut manually, chainsaw, cable skidder. Main reason for that is to be able to extract that big timber without damaging the younger growth, to ensure that it's there again. Number one priority here was to ensure you get the market value out of each tree cut. That's one of the key words with a crop tree harvest. And as you can see, we took a lot of care here not to damage any of the young stand. And the other thing, within a skidding system, you do churn up the ground, and you will really encourage the regeneration of your yellow birch. The question in regards to the tonnage that come off this 65-acre stand is 933.14 tons. The breakdown on that was 482 ton of saw logs, 62 tons of veneer, and 388 tons of firewood. The average compensation to the landowner for this type of a harvest was $436.12 per acre. And the average price per ton that that landowner received out of this harvest, straight across the board, is $30.37 per ton. By comparison, the paperwork I have on a 1,000-acre cut that came from Greg Fraser, that New Page did on a crown stand in Guysborough County, and they did a mix of saw logs, veneer, and biomass. The payout to the province equaled $102,000 and change, which equaled $5.39 a ton. But that forest is, for all practical purposes, principally cut. You don't have this kind of stocking left when it was finished. In this stand, with the value we've taken out of it, and what's left, it's still densely stemmed. It would make an ideal stand for what New Page would like to do from a biomass perspective, because the logs are out of it. You'd be looking at a yield of from 20 to 30 ton per acre, more apt to be 30 ton because it's very thick. And at $2.50 a ton, I feel that type of a forest that is grown vigorously, it's healthy, that it has a lot more value than $75 an acre.
And the method that they would use in order to remove this
The
stand?
method to use, you know, Nina Paper would use a feller bunch of grapple skidders and pull the whole tree to the road and ship it. But at New Page, where they're leaving the debris in the woods, they'll end up with a third less yield than say, Kimberly Clark or Nina Paper, which actually means to fulfill the demands of that mill, they're going to have to cut a third more acres like this. And you got to remember, if they're only getting 20 ton to the acre out of a stand like this, which they're going to leave a third of it in the woods, you're at $50 an acre to have it basically annihilated. And then at some point, somebody's going to come along and want the taxpayer to fund the reforestation of that at a later date. You can talk to any of the bigger contractors, I'd rather not use their names here, and they will tell you that what has taken place is we're just decimating, you know, it's a duplication of what went on with the fishery, is what we're doing to our forest. There's one right there, 240 bucks, American. That's a good stick.
For one tree?
And $240 for that one log. That is 10 foot long with a 17-inch top, yellow birch. Another one right there, $277.90. That's another yellow birch, 18-inch top, 10 feet. This is a stand that was harvested approximately 7 years ago by New Page. And as you can see, as you look down those strips, the main tree there was a yellow birch. But with the harvesting practices that they've used, you can easily see that most of what your regeneration is red maple and balsam fir. Those were cut and forwarded. Even if, with the opening, if that had been skidded and scarified with the skidders, you would have had yellow birch regeneration. But due to that same approach of applying softwood harvesting practices on a hardwood stand, what you've got coming back is low-grade intolerant hardwood with some balsam fir through it. Here we've just got an example of using softwood equipment in a hardwood stand that it can't be harvested. You got a 10-inch top. You've got there's still a 7-foot saw log in it, and the overall length of that piece of wood that is completely, usable is 14 feet. So basically, 50% of the bole of that tree is left. And you see what's going to happen to it. It's going to rot. This piece of wood we're looking at, it's got a 10-inch top, and I've just measured 14 feet of workable wood in this. It has a short log in it of 7 feet. Doesn't have a great deal of commercial value, let's say $3. But just an example of what happens when you use softwood equipment to log hardwood. It can't be completely manufactured. In here, you'll see there's the reason why you come to a limb and any single grip head is not going to pound through those kind of limbs, so they're left in the bush. Here we have the 15-inch top, and you've got at least 24 feet of top quality biomass or hardwood pulp in that stem. But as you can look at it, a mechanical head won't cut it. So it's left in the bush to rot. Basically the butt of that top quality tree is ruined. And in hardwood, your butt is your most valuable part. The dollar has to start at the bottom as you work your way up. But that tree there, between butt shattered and broken off, it's basically rendered useless. Now that tree could have been manually felled with a large chainsaw, and you could have maximized the value out of that tree right from the ground up. Here we have a 16-inch top on a yellow birch. I'm going to run the tape out. I can't get it at all because my tape's only 16 feet. And the piece of wood that's left here, well, right now I'm in excess of 16 feet, and there's still a fair amount of wood left beyond that. And that's also left because softwood gear won't cut hardwood. Just a prime case of no regard for value. Here we have an example of a large yellow birch that somebody cut with a buncher. They didn't have the power to get the whole thing off, and a barber chaired on them. So another case that just demonstrates that they can't utilize what's in that tree even if they try to. No, if you removed, like I just use that as a round number, about 15 crop trees to an acre, and then you can have a good return on that ground, and you still have a forest that's living, one that would look very similar to what we were in on Browns Mountain that I had cut in 2004. Of the stumps that were left, well, this was cut in 1950, in the early 50s, and as you can see, the trees that were a little small at the time now are certainly marketable trees, and this was cut pretty hard. There's one there, there's another stump here. I can see another one there at about 60 feet. Another really big one down there at about 150 feet. So this can sustain this type of harvest on an ongoing basis. Quite a contrast to what's across the road. And we're pretty fortunate here because we're now standing only 200 feet from where we had the pictures of all those large tops. And this was one uniform stand. I remember it well. I hunted through it, traveled through it many times over the years. So we're able to get a before and after outlook. And in this earlier outlook, we're also able to see that this was worked in a crop tree selection cut years ago.
So it's left on the ground across the street is essentially the tops of...
Yeah, exactly. Tops of what these trees were, right? Here we have an example of a healthy little 6-inch breast height birch. This tree would have only been a seedling when it was cut when this lot was cut 50 years ago, selectively. If I was to log this selectively today, that tree, one of my main priorities is not to touch it or discard or anything else. That's the tree that should be left for the fellow that's going to come 50 years behind me. Where across the road, that tree was just flattened. Even worse, all these across the road in this size range that are 3.5 inches at breast height, and that tree's similar in age as well. That tree's pushing 50 years old. Those are all still flattened, and what's in it? Maybe $1 worth of wood. So it doesn't equal good forest management practices.
It's not...
Fiber for the moment is what it is.
It's not sustainable.
It's not sustainable.
I mean, if you really want to look at what the definition of sustainable, it's leaving the resource for future generations.
Exactly.
Which
Take a little in order to make it work at the time, maximize its value, and ensure that you leave something behind that will be equally as good as what you walked into. It's perceived as being economically viable, and I guess it is viable if you pay enough, and if you don't put any contribution into ensuring what is to come next. That's a different story. That's where it really comes into the equation.
their definition of sustainable is solely based on economic.
For the
not
moment.
social, for the moment.
Nothing to do with long term.
Not for the future generations.
No, nothing. No. It's only for the moment. Here we're on a piece of property of Scott Cook's that's on the south side of Salmon River that was clear cut for hardwood in 1966-67. As you can see, what we have here is basically nothing but regeneration of red maple, 95%, and this property was clear cut in such a way there was no shade trees left, and obviously the ground wasn't scarified in any great deal because there's no yellow birch regeneration or any tolerant hardwood on the ground. Basically, this is what the end result will be of the forest as a result of the clear cuts that Storer are doing on those tolerant hardwood ridges that we had filmed north of Ocean Lake. This is what your end result will be in about another 40 years, 40 odd years. There's little commercial value stuff in it other than biomass or fuel wood. And the species we have here, it doesn't matter what you do with it, whether you thin it or you can do what you please, and it'll never make a sawlog. It's nothing but bottom-end material. So it's pretty easy to see from my views that what NewPage is doing on those jobs, this is the end result they're trying to meet. And actually, if I was looking to grow a fiber farm in order to grow biomass, this would be the end result I'd be looking to achieve. And in this stand, there's no potential future as far as a saw log or a veneer log goes at any time. It's strictly geared to grow a biomass forest. The other thing from a wildlife perspective, red maple is at the bottom of the list in terms of wildlife habitat, where yellow birch is our dominant species that's preferred by grouse. And I do see in the management of these public lands, one of the points that is stressed is to manage it for wildlife, both grouse, deer, and moose. And yellow birch is the preferred species of all those species. So I don't really see a lot of benefit here, like in the local area to the community or to the forest itself, other than the long-term growth of biomass with this type of harvesting, past harvesting practice that is still being carried out today in the tolerant hardwood stands. Okay, here we're in a stand that was cut in 1957, in the winters of 1958. As you can see ahead of me, right here we got some stumps, the old stumps when this was logged. Selectively, it was cut for grade hardwood. As you can look here right now, you can see the regeneration of this, little 5-inch birch that is like second growth. That's your future crop tree. This is stuff that would have been basically just a seed in the ground when it was logged before. And at the same time, you can look behind me, and you can see a nice yellow birch here that's 12 inches at 13 inches at breast height. But this is the kind of tree that should be harvested today. And the one thing you want to see here as well is that the yellow birch regeneration is certainly the one is the most beneficial as far as wildlife goes. And it's a diversified forest. You got a little bit of balsam fir, you got a little bit of red maple. I can stand here and I can look right here and I can see a large sugar maple to my left. So there is quite a diversification in this forest in terms of age. We've got approximately 3 different age classes that I can see. You've got the very young ones that are 25 years old, and you've got the 35 to 50 year old, and you've got the 100-year. And in a selective harvest, you'd be targeting the trees that are over the 100 years and trying to ensure you leave the young stuff that's as unscarred as possible, so that this can be done in another 50 years in a sustainable manner. By comparison to the last stand we were on that was cut in 1966, that it was completely clear cut, and all you have is intolerant hardwoods, basically a biomass forest. But here you have a forest that can accommodate diversification of wildlife, our grouse, moose, deer, and at the same point you're going to ensure a future crop tree or sawlog forest as well. So it's a diversified forest that can accommodate a whole different diversified group of interests, where in the other one basically what you have is a fiber farm. This tree is the largest yellow birch that I've seen in Nova Scotia, and in this entire plateau west of the Isaacs Harbour, or east of the Isaacs Harbour River. I know there is none bigger, and that tree is approximately 600 years old. This is what we have in Guysborough County in terms of the original Acadian forest, which would consist of largely yellow birch, hard maple, soft maple, some beech. Here you have about as, good as straight a quality of tree as what you'll find. 2 veneer logs in it. You get a butt log there that's easy worth $250, and a second cut that's worth about 125. We had a better one over further we'll take a look at later, but this is an exceptional tree.
$375?
About $375 is what you'd get out of that tree. Yeah, not to mention the pieces of fuel wood or chipper wood that are in it as well. But this is as good as they come. This is a birch that, if you recall, in some of the last work we did on the Stora mechanical jobs, they'd have to hit that about 3 times to bring it down, basically destroy it. The tree weighs about a ton, so if it's improperly manufactured, it could end up in the chipper wood pile, which would yield the province about $2.50. And the butt log on this, 10'6", 9/6 to a 10'6", that will top, about 30 inches. You're getting in the vicinity of a $700 to $800 stick here. So that was at the peak. You'd be down considerably now. You'd probably be to 500. But that's as good as we get in Nova Scotia. It's as good as it comes. It's definitely in the vicinity of 375 to 400 years old. So, and as I will state again, this is a stand that's never been cut. It is one of the few remaining stands of virgin birch in Guysborough County. Ideally, I think it would be probably in the best interest of the community that this stand is left intact.
Or what would happen to the log after?
Well, it all depends on how the thing gets handled.
It certainly wouldn't go into just biomass.
Well, it depends. What I saw happen on some of those stumps was easy to see. I've run feller bunchers myself. I've owned them. But you got to remember, there's no piece of machinery that's in the equation that I haven't run. So I know I know their limitations, right? And I saw where they come to a birch that's nearly as big as the table we're sitting at, and those heads will cut 20 inches, some 22. So you cut in this way. They can't cut it. You track around, you cut that way. The cuts normally don't line up. It's impossible when you're in the cab. You're going to be off 3 or 4 inches, and there's lots of evidence there. And we filmed a little bit of it on the ground. And you get a split in it, and then it doesn't reach quite here or here. So then you're forcing it off. You're breaking it off, and so you've got shatter going up the inside the tree at least 2 feet. Then you've got a rip up each side of the log. So all of a sudden, I don't know if they'll tackle some of the bigger ones we looked at. They may have sense enough to leave that alone because it's dangerous as well, right? It can come backwards on top of the cab. So all of a sudden, we've got that log severely damaged. It's definitely not going to make veneer. Depends on how bad it's broken up. It could land at the sawmill, but instead of it being, $200 to $300 a ton log, all of a sudden it's hitting into the sawmill. It's not even a top quality $80 a ton log because it's damaged bad. It could be graded down to $60. So you've devalued it dramatically. Now, if you really do a job on it, or really do a bad number on it, it could land in the biomass pile, which is roadside prices. I'll say $22.50 a ton, or when NewPage wants to give the province $2.50 a ton. So as you can see, it all depends on how it's handled. Now, they're going to say, oh no, that'll be handled properly. I saw that quote made at a public meeting, but we were at places that prove differently. That the only thing we can look at is what they've done in the past. And once the damage is done, you can't rectify it. It's done, it's finished, it's over. It's past tense. And case being made again, if they had to pay the value before they went in there, now then you have an insurance that they're going to get it right. But with their own accountability, they're accountable basically to nobody. We just have more duplication of the same kind of action. So I think my point is kind of made there. I'm really stressing here, there's so many venues to look at, and from the political one, it's a means of giving the people some control over their destiny, because you would be giving them access to some control over their resource.
So we are, in fact, on Crown land, you say. Where exactly are we, Scott?
On the Loon Lake Road.
Loon Lake Road, at the back of Loon Lake, eh?
Yeah, back of Donahoo's Lake.
And this hardwood belongs to who?
Store of Forest Industries.
My goodness. And why do you think they they haven't bothered to use it.
No idea.
Now, you own a sawmill. Would you have liked to do something with this wood?
Yes, I offered to buy it, but they wouldn't sell it.
Well, that's too bad. How many cords of wood do you think that there might be up here that's just going to waste?
Probably 8 to 1,200 cords, somewhere in that area, 1,000 cords probably.
My goodness. And what does Stora pay the government for this?
I've heard $2.50 a cord stumpage. But now, if they don't haul it, I suppose it's nothing.
Oh, I suppose, yes. So it really hasn't cost them very much.
No.
But even if they did pay for it, it would only cost $2 or $3 a cord. And what you said you would have been willing to pay them even with it half rotten at least last year. You said you offered them how much? 40?
It's 40 for some piles and 20 for the ones that were pretty rotten.
Really rotten. Yes. My goodness. Well, it would have been worth Stora's while to take you up on that offer. Why did they not? They would have made money hand over fist.
They weren't interested.
That seems a very strange arrangement. And I suppose that if you can't get wood, then there's a lot of people going to be laid off from your mill.
Yeah, it would be probably half a dozen that work around.
That work around, and if there's no wood, there's just no jobs for these people. Again, you'd think that the government would be able to perhaps twist some arms to get a little bit more employment. They're always talking about this unemployment. They're not doing very much about it, eh?
It's been a contentious issue between a few of us that have had an interest in this, accessing this forest for a long while. And I first approached Stora in '94 about cutting crown hardwood. This would have been after some of the situations Scott dealt with, and in '94 was when it became hardwood was really on the upswing in terms of value. And there was a couple of people in the province that were quite instrumental in developing this hardwood industry to where it's at today, and I was one of them. At that time, when I approached Stora, Russ Waycott was the woodlands manager there at the time, and he informed me we didn't have any of this crown hardwood in Nova Scotia. We didn't have any of this great hardwood in Nova Scotia. And after that, I went to DNR, and they informed me the same thing. So it was kind of ironic that 5 years later, when I tried to approach it again, I'd been exporting it for 5 years, and it was a product that they told me didn't exist. And ironically, the problem that I see with it is within the education system, in terms of training professional foresters and technicians. They seem to believe that for hardwood to be a viable product, it had to be standing in the same uniform sizes and diameters as what we have balsam fir in this country. And ironically, that doesn't happen anywhere. It doesn't exist. And what's happened here, what they did when they started to play with hardwood management, and I'll use that term back about 15 years ago, they just took the book on spruce and they reapplied it to hardwood. Well, it doesn't work. It's a different species, it's a different forest, a different ecosystem. And they will admit today, a lot of them, that it was a mistake. But at that point, oh no, that was like the Bible. That was right. In hardwood, grade equals much more value than volume. Grade is upmost. In lots of cases, a 7-foot log is worth more than a 9-foot one, or definitely with veneers, an 8.9 or a 9.6 can be worth more than a 10.6 or an 11.6. So you're cutting it to grade, and it's a little hard to get into detail of that here, but total different approach than what the New Page approach is. The New Page approach has been to clear cut hardwood, to flatten it. It goes to a low-end product, a bit of logs picked out. In recent years they've switched to mechanization, and it's been an application of softwood equipment to log hardwood, and that equipment is not big enough, it's not designed to cut hardwood. You get tremendous amount of damage in the felling of it, with butt shatter, with breakage, with too much of a scarf left on the bottom that causes a rip up the side of the log, devaluing it. And then when it comes to trying to process it, when they come to a limb, as you'll see in the video work we did, they can't limb it. And it's not much short of a genocide of a resource is what they've actually done. But they're not really interested in servicing a sawmill or a veneer mill. They're interested in serving themselves. And when that hits the bottom end of the pile, if the operator splits a big hardwood, it doesn't mean much that it went from $300 a ton to, you know, a $22.50 a ton product. Not when you're the one that's using it. And they have to open their eyes and realize that they're not the only player in this game. And they have to realize that there's those of us that think that that should be looked upon as a piece of property that's got value to the community. It's a means of giving the people some control over their destiny, because you would be giving them access to some control over their resource. One of the things that's happened with this large-scale forestry, as Stores, you know, NewPage is practicing, is there's going to be public funds needed in order to accommodate the keyword sustainability. And I have an issue when we take a God-given resource and we turn it into a public liability. Like, if it doesn't justify sustainability within the equation at the present time of harvest, it should be left alone until somebody else comes along and has enough ingenuity to be able to do it, incorporate it within the harvest, and not make it a public liability. You're taking an asset and turning it into a liability.